Hi class, welcome to week 6. So this is part 1 of 2 videos this week, and what I'll be doing in this video is going over the rhetoric side of things and talking about and kind of walking through the PowerPoint I posted earlier today. If you want to see about the assignment, please check out that other video. Alright, so let's start on slide 1. What is rhetoric? So that's the question at hand. This is something you might have heard kind of tossed around political debates where people say, this politician's speech was all rhetoric, didn't have any substance. And so we might hear this term kind of thrown out a lot, but not really quite understand what it means. Same thing too in other disciplines. You might look at rhetoric and think about the symbolism is a strong rhetorical device, and so we've actually been talking about that in the past couple weeks. But this term gets thrown around a lot, and so we have to kind of look at the history of it in order to understand how it relates to what we're doing. So in order to do that, we're going to go to around 300 BCE in terms of looking at where rhetoric started and looking at the art of oratory and kind of looking at that in terms of trying to understand what rhetoric is. Now, just to kind of recap at the front of things, what are the two things or ways in which we're going to be looking at rhetoric? Well, number one, illustrating the relationship between writer and reader. We're going to talk about that more later, but this idea that there is this relationship between the two. Two, it's going to give us a set of terms to use. These terms are going to be really important. You're going to see them coming back again next week, and we've actually kind of already been introduced to a lot of these terms before, so that by having these terms, it gives us a way to kind of break things down and point it out. So for instance, if you want to talk about the symbolism of something, if we didn't have that term to use, we couldn't really point it out for someone else. So the terms are going to be very important. So let's get into the history of things to kind of talk about that relationship between writer and reader. So Greek sort of democracy, very different and similar to our own in the sense that who could vote what is much different from it would be nowadays. So the qualifications, as you can see on the slide, free native born men owned property. One similarity though is that if you met those qualifications, you could theoretically move up on the sort of social ladder by virtue of your speaking / arguing abilities. And by arguing, I mean by arguing your point, and that's going to be kind of the point of rhetoric in a way. So it was really important for someone that wanted to kind of move up, that maybe they're down here and they have property not that much, but you want your kids to kind of rise up, of course, so that there were these people called the sophists, and their jobs were to basically tutor and train people in the art of rhetoric, and the whole point was to get them better at speaking and arguing their points in public so that they can push their agenda and rise up in the society, basically, right? And so the similar kind of to the American dream in a way, but this was not a dream or an opportunity open to everyone, right? Like you had to have these qualifications first before you could theoretically move up the ladder. Now, were these sophists that I talked about, who were basically the tutors of the day in order to train people in rhetoric, were they all beloved? No. So you ever read Socrates? Like he kind of rails against these people from time to time, much like he does everyone else though. But basically that they're just training people in the art of flattery, and that they're not really getting to the truth of things, they're just flattering other people. Hence the distrust of rhetoric, and you'll see that people are distrustful of rhetoric not only during this time period, but even today, where people get kind of worried about being conned into agreeing with someone, and that this art of flattery that was used as a derogative term is something that's still around today, where people use rhetoric in order to flatter other people, or motivate other people to do things. And we'll get that later when we're talking about ethos, pathos, and logos. And so politicians like today, they use rhetoric to kind of advance their points, right? All right, so if we look at the sort of the system where you see, like, you have the chickens on one side and the soldiers on the other, this is my representation of two sides sort of arguing for more money to go to one or the other. And so if you actually play out the whole slide, you can see that the person using rhetoric wins his case, hence he loses his chickens, right? I had a little too much fun this week with the PowerPoint, I know. But anyway, if we go to that last slide, the whole point of rhetoric, or the two main points of it at least, were to learn how to make an effective argument and take on someone else's argument. And so those were the things that the sophists would teach you in order to help you become more successful at arguing, right? If you've ever seen the movie 300, which I wouldn't say maybe is the most accurate representation of Greek democracy, please don't quote me on that, but just as sort of it illustrates this point, though, that the taking down of someone else's argument is almost just as important as making your own. You'll remember there's a scene where the queen loses in the argument, but she's able to discredit her opponent, and she discredits him by, I believe, stabbing him, and then the money falls out, and lo and behold, oh, it's the money that he was bribed by the king that is trying to invade. Side note, don't take the money of the foreign invader, right? So if Russia wants to pay you, do not get the money in rubles or something. Get it in American dollars so people don't know. I'm going off on a tangent. Anyway, the reason why she wins the argument is that she wants to discredits him, and that's how she wins. He actually makes the more effective argument, but this turns out to be not credible. So those are two really important things that these sophists would teach their students in order to make them more effective. All right, so what are the tenets of rhetoric besides just breaking things, like making arguments and taking some other people's arguments down? If you look at the characteristics of a classic rhetorical text, these are the sort of four areas that they would kind of look at in order to construct an argument. So if you see verbal, this is dealing with the word choice. So we still have this as a concern today. If you're on the discussion boards, you have to use a very specific type of language. You're not using text speak. You're proofreading. You're theoretically revising what you're saying. And this would be totally different if you were texting your friends. You would use slang, emoticons, things like this in order to convey your point, so that you have to know who your audience is to know what language you're using. So that's what verbal means, is the word choice and knowing the proper word choice in a given situation. Expositional, this is the idea that you are expanding your argument, that you're using supporting evidence to help expand that argument. So if I ever make note of this, like for instance, in the DVDs or the papers, and you say, oh, well, there was very strong symbolism in this particular passage, but you don't provide specific evidence, like the quote or something like this, I'll, try to point that out. And the reason is, it goes back to this. We have to use specific examples in order to make our points. This would be the same, if you're trying to, let's say you want to borrow your parents' car and you're a kid, a teenager, right? You can't just say, I want to borrow your car. Well, you would have to, give them reasons and supporting evidence, like, I'm doing it for this reason. I'm a trustworthy person. I pay for my own insurance. All these supporting evidence to back up your point. So this is another area. The next one is called discrete, meaning that there's a beginning, middle, end. This deals with organization. So like this PowerPoint, I tried to organize it right. It had a beginning, look at history. Now we're looking at the characteristics, and then we're going to go into ethos, pathos, and logos, so that there's this idea that I have a structure, right? I'm not just sort of rambling, which I hope you don't think I do most weeks. All right, next, hierarchical. This just goes back to a single message that you have a thesis, a single point, right? This point of this PowerPoint is to teach you about rhetoric. That's the thesis, my thing that I'm trying to get across to you. So with these 4 areas, there's this idea that we're looking at these 4 areas of concern in order to kind of help build the argument, while also put in other ingredients like we talked about later, like ethos, pathos, logos, and even things like symbolism, all this stuff. These are all sort of things that get kind of in the hopper and that we use them to help create the message. The 4 areas that we just talked about, those are just sort of like the big building blocks almost. And those are the things that we look for on like the rubric. If you look at the rubric, these are the things you're graded on. So part of the reason I'm bringing that up is that you are part of this tradition that stems back many years ago. All right, so let's talk about how this applies to the classic rhetorical situation. So on the next slide, you'll see this guy has a light bulb, he has an idea, he wants to tell people about chair, because let's say in this world he just invented a chair, okay? So if he's going to tell it to someone else, he has to be very careful in terms of how he communicates what a chair is, right? Because as the slides show you, there's office chairs, magical chairs, wooden chairs, porcelain chairs, and then if you're very confused, there's chair, or chair. And so that you'll see here that describing something like chair is not as easy as you would think, so that we have to learn how to harness language. And how do we harness language? Well, it goes back to those 4 things that we talked about earlier, and then other things like ethos and pathos and logos. Now, even more confusing or hard is when we have something like love. Well, how do you communicate what love is? Because love is so multifaceted. There's sort of romantic love. There's love that you might have for your children, love that you have for cats, and of course, the most important love, the love of food, especially tacos, right? So that this idea, this situation is that as humans, we're always in a situation where someone has an idea and they want to communicate that idea to someone else. That's where you see this next slide where it says a certain situation where you have the intent, which is the idea, and that we put that into what's called a text, or this gets back to the idea of form, because it could be a song, it could be a poem, it could be a painting, it could be a PowerPoint. It's my intent putting it into this form, and then you, the reader, are watching, reading, listening, and gaining significance of it. And so if you notice that there's kind of an invisible barrier there where I can't talk directly to the reader in the sense that I have to put my ideas into something, even if it's just language, like I'm talking to you now. I might have an internal thought, but I have to articulate that internal thought and give it to you through speech, or give it to you through a painting. So there's not a sort of Vulcan mind meld thing where I could just sort of grab onto you and just transfer all my ideas to you. I have to put that into something, okay? Now, the confusion comes where I might have that great intent, but I don't utilize language or whatever mode I'm using to the full extent, and that's where there can be disconnection. All right, so the 4 things we talked about earlier, verbal, discrete, those will help you make sure that you don't sort of screw up that sort of communication. There's other types of rhetorical devices that people use in order to help maintain interest. Those are ethos, pathos, and logos. So let's talk about those now. Ethos, and I decided to put our president there because for better or worse, whatever you feel about him, or any president for that matter,